Before skyscrapers, before supermarkets, before tractors and traffic, there was a city that floated quite literally on a lake. In the heart of ancient Mexico, the Aztecs built something quietly astonishing. Farms made not of land, but of mud, reeds, and dreams. These floating gardens, known as Chinampas, didn't just feed one of the biggest cities in the world, they fed it so well. They didn't need to conquer more land just for food. Tonight, as you get ready to rest, we'll gently drift back in time to uncover how these silent farms came to be, why they were shaped like long, narrow rafts, and how their muddy roots have stretched across centuries, even surviving the fall of the empire itself. Settle in, close your eyes, and let's float along the quiet canals of Tenochtitlan, where history grows slowly in soft layers of silt and silence. A city that floated before it was built. You're floating quietly now, drifting not just on water, but through time. It's the early morning of a year no longer remembered, in a city long buried by concrete and conquest. You open your eyes to see a faint silver mist rising over a lake so still, it mirrors the sky around you, just barely visible through the fog. Are rectangular islands, neat, narrow, artificial. They float gently, anchored only by stakes and a sense of purpose. This is the Valley of Mexico. The lake is Lake Texcoco, and that shape slowly forming in the morning haze. That's the early outline of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. But Tenochtitlan did not rise first with temples or soldiers. Before the city could grow tall, it had to float. Before it could dominate trade and diplomacy and the bloody poetry of empire, it had to figure out a far simpler question. How do you grow corn in a lake? That question would lead to one of the quietest revolutions in world agriculture. Not a mechanical invention, not a crop hybrid, but something softer, slower. Mud, bundled reeds, patient hands, and a careful balance of water and willpower. It would lead to the Chinampa, a place where soil wasn't given, it had to be made. Tenochtitlan, as legend has it, was built on a sign, an eagle on a cactus, devouring a snake. It's poetic, yes, but less practical when you consider that the eagle had landed in the middle of a shallow, salty lake. There wasn't much to build on. The soil was spongy and waterlogged. Trees couldn't root deeply. There were no dry, expansive fields for corn. Most civilizations might have moved on, but the Mexico later known as the Aztecs were nothing if not stubborn dreamers. And they weren't entirely starting from scratch. For centuries before the Aztecs, smaller Nahua communities had already begun experimenting with a strange idea. What if land could be built by hand? This wasn't land reclaimed from the sea in great dry dikes or drained marshes, like the Dutch would later do. It was something gentler, a more deliberate arrangement of natural processes. They called it Chinamidal, from the Nahuatl word for square. Made of canes. Today, we call them Chinampas, the humble ingredients, reeds, roots, and rot. A Chinampa begins with a woven frame. Think of it like a raft made from reeds and sticks, but slightly sunken. Farmers would drive long wooden stakes into the shallow lakebed in rectangles, usually 30 by 2.5 meters. Between these stakes they wove reeds, forming underwater fences that outlined each future floating field. Next came the filling. Sediment from the lake bottom was dredged up by hand-thick, black, worm-rich mud, known to be incredibly fertile. Mixed with decaying plant matter, this was piled into the frame. Then came aquatic weeds, especially azala, a floating fern that fixed nitrogen and fed the soil, layer after layer. They built up a platform that was more sponge than soil, more patience than property. The result was an island that sat just at the water's surface, dense and moist and perpetually nourished. But it wasn't enough to make it float. You had to make it stay. For that, they used trees, willow guardians, and anchored dreams. At each corner of the Chinampa, farmers planted awo trees, willows that love wet feet and grow quickly. These served multiple purposes. First, they anchored the floating field to the lakebed. Second, Their roots wove through the soil, strengthening it. Third, their branches shaded the crops and protected them from wind. Finally, they provided timber, firewood, and even fodder over the years. In time, these trees became towering sentinels over neat rows of corn, tomatoes, chili peppers, and amaranth. They added a sense of permanence to the otherwise fluid landscape, like someone sketching walls on water with only shadows and leaves. Imagine the calm repetition of it, building one rectangle, then another. Dredging, weaving, planting, anchoring, no loud tools, no shouts. Just the hush of lake water against the reeds, the slow squelch of mud lifted from beneath, and the creak of willow roots settling into place. This was not the work of kings. It was the work of gardeners. Day after day, year after year, Hava Lake became a map of labor. Over time, these Chinampas multiplied, not randomly, but in careful grids. From above, the southern lakes of the Valley of Mexico began to resemble an enormous woven quilt of farmland. Between each Chinampa was a narrow canal, just wide enough for a canoe. In total, it's estimated there were over 22,000 hectares of Chinampa agriculture around Lake Xochimilco and Lake Calco, enough to feed a city of hundreds of thousands. And here's where it gets even sleepier. There were no plows, no heavy beasts of burden, no steel tools, just stone blades, wooden paddles, and bare hands. Farmers crouched low, tending to each row of corn with gentle precision. Children helped gather lake weeds. Women sifted seeds and tied squash vines to reed stakes in a single day. A farmer might not walk far at all, perhaps no more than 100 steps back and forth between crops and canoe. The land was always damp beneath their feet. The air, heavy with the smell of wet earth, mildew, and warm leaves, and still, this slow labor produced astonishing yields, up to 7 harvests per year on the same plot. Why? Because Chinampas, unlike dry farms, didn't need rain. They had the lake. The lake didn't flood them. The lake fed them, the unseen genius, compost and canal rotation. Much of the brilliance of Chinampa farming lay beneath the surface. Aztec farmers practiced a kind of early permaculture. They rotated crops and left canals fallow for regrowth. They dredged mud not just for building, but for fertilizing existing fields. Night soil, that is, human waste was collected from public toilets and added to compost piles. Ducks and fish in the canals added nutrients naturally. Even in death, the cycle continued. Some families buried their dead beneath the fields, believing their ancestors would help feed the corn that fed their children. A Chinampa was never finished. It was maintained, constantly repaired, replenished, and gently reshaped with each season. A field might float for generations, shifting slightly year to year, growing more fertile with age, but it never shouted its brilliance. It didn't rise in pyramids. It didn't carve its name into stone. It just quietly grew food, season after season, reed after reed, what the city owed to the garden. By the time Hernan Cortes and his men arrived in the early 1500s, Tenochtitlan was a city of over 200,000 people, possibly more. Its markets bustled, its temples gleamed, its warriors wore feathers and gold. But the real reason the city could exist at all, Chinampas, these floating fields, invisible to the glory of conquest, were the quiet foundation. They fed the workers who built the temples, the priests who sang the chants, the merchants who counted cacao beans and quetzal feathers. Even Moctezuma, emperor of the Aztecs, relied on floating farms to feed his court, and yet no statues were carved in the farmers' names. No murals honored the mud that held the empire together. It was all just dirt, arranged very, very carefully, a question beneath the mud. So as you sit with this image of a lake transformed by hands into harvests, consider this. What other histories were shaped not by swords or scrolls, but by reeds, mud, and patient fingers? And how many have floated by unnoticed? the rhythm of mud and water. By the time the morning mists drifted quietly across Lake Xochimilco, the Chinampas, those who worked the floating fields, were already awake. Their calloused hands reached for tools that had been passed down for generations: flat wooden paddles, woven baskets, digging sticks. The earth beneath them wasn't earth in the usual sense. It was a layered, living quilt of mud, roots, decaying reeds, and dreams that had been shaped over centuries. How the Chinampas were made, again and again. Building a Chinampa was not a one-time effort. It was an ongoing dialogue between humans, lake and sky. The farmers began by staking out a rectangular frame in the shallow lakebed, usually something like 30 meters long and 2.5 meters wide. The stakes were often made from awok trees, a type of willow whose roots helped anchor the structure. Then came the weaving. Long mats of reeds were interlaced around the perimeter, forming a retaining wall of sorts, and then mud, buckets and baskets of it, dredged up from the rich black lakebed, were heaped into the enclosure: silt, decayed plant matter, and fish droppings, all thick with nutrients, were packed layer by layer. They piled it high, mixed it with more reeds and even dry lake grass until the surface rose just above the waterline. And then the planting began on this living raft of nourishment. The Aztecs planted maize, beans, squash, chiles, amaranth, and even flowers. They spaced each crop just so, aware of the wind patterns, the shade cast by nearby trees, and the subtle ways in which one plant might support another. A season of care. Life on a Chinampa wasn't dramatic or fast. It was repetitive, purposeful, almost meditative. Days were organized by what the plants needed and what the lake allowed. There were no beasts of burden here, no great wheels or carts. Everything was carried by hand or loaded into long canoes. Chinampas would glide silently between rows, inspecting stalks of maize for signs of rot or pests. They'd gently run their fingers along squash vines, checking for dew. Sometimes they whispered to the plants, not out of superstition, but habit. You spent enough time among the vegetables, and it became hard not to talk to them. During the dry season, the work changed. Water had to be coaxed from deeper parts of the lake and poured carefully around the roots of each plant. The sun was more intense, and the risk of drying out the delicate Chinampa layers became real. Cracks in the mud were carefully patched. Extra reeds were added. The Chinampa was not just a farm. It was a living surface, the guardians of the soil. Every Chinampero knew that Chinampas were not permanent. Without care, they would sink, collapse, dissolve back into the lake. The balance between the cultivated and the wild was delicate. The willow trees that awots played a quiet but vital role. They grew tall, casting dappled shade over the rows of crops. Their roots bound the edges of the island together. But too many trees, and you risked crowding out the sunlight. Too few, and the corners would begin to sag into the water. So the farmers pruned, replanted, and studied. They recorded rainfall by scratching marks into bits of pottery or bone. They observed the flight paths of herons and the habits of frogs. These were not idle curiosities. If the frogs left the lake edge, something was wrong. If the herons didn't, the water might be warming too quickly. Even children helped, learning the difference between edible greens and invasive weeds. Their tiny hands reached into the water to catch small fish that darted between the reeds, some of which were later used to fertilize the soil. Rituals of the mud. The Aztecs did not separate agriculture from the spiritual. The Chinampa was not just a field, it was sacred ground. Several times a year, quiet ceremonies were held on these floating islands. Offerings were made to Tlaloc, the god of rain, and Xilonen, the maize goddess. Often, the offerings were as simple as a few kernels of corn, wrapped in a leaf and placed beneath the soil. Sometimes a flower, sometimes a whispered promise. On particularly sacred days, the Chinampas might offer tamales to the lake wrapped in corn husks, gently lowered into the water. The hope was simple, that the water would stay kind, that the rains would not drown the crops, that the floating fields would not drift or sink. There were even lullabies for the mud. Elders, those who remembered when the city had been smaller, sang slow songs while planting new willows. The songs spoke of roots and balance, of how the mud must be coaxed, not commanded. It was a tradition not recorded in codices or official records, but passed through humming voices and work-hardened hands. Not quite land, not quite lake. Chinampas occupied a liminal space. They were not dry land, but not open water either. They were somewhere in between, a thin compromise between the floating world and the rooted one. This ambiguity shaped how the Aztecs thought about property. Land ownership in the Chinampa zones wasn't about fences or walls. It was about stewardship. Who tended the mud? Who added reeds in the dry months? Who remembered to dredge the water channels in spring? If you cared for the Chinampa, it was yours. But let it decay, and it would disappear. Not metaphorically. Literally, some Chinampas had names like family pets. Some had stories tied to them. This one was built the year the lake froze. Or this one never grows good childs after the thunderstorm of 42. They became characters in the life of the community. Silent, soggy characters that still needed regular weeding. Aztec bureaucracy meets the mud. And of course, no empire, even one made of floating fields, could escape the reach of paperwork. The Chinampa system was tightly regulated. The city-state of Tenochtitlan had agricultural officials who counted Chinampas, measured crop yields, and ensured tributes were collected. Farmers had to report their harvest to temple scribes. If your Chinampa produced more flowers this year, you might be taxed in marigolds, yet it was all done with a kind of gentle slowness. No quills, no scrolls. Instead, the scribes used bark paper and bits of carved bone or stone. Crops were tallied using pictographs. A good harvest might be celebrated with a small feast. A bad one might be quietly overlooked, especially if you were known as a careful tender of the mud. Over time, the Chinampa zones expanded, spreading out like lily pads across the lake south of Tenochtitlan. Some were linked by narrow wooden walkways. Others had to be reached by canoe. Entire neighborhoods floated, glided, and drifted, not literally, but emotionally, across the lake's changing moods. And yet, each one needed daily, invisible labor, each one whispered reminders that food came from mud, that survival depended on water, and that nothing good ever stayed fixed without a little weeding. But how long could such a delicate system endure? Could these floating farms truly stand the test of empire, drought, or change? The silent harvest, how Chinampas endured through time. By the time the sun had begun to dip behind the craggy spine of the Sierra Madre, casting golden light across the shallow waters of Lake Xochimilco, the floating farms of the Aztec Empire Chinampas stood like sleepy sentinels in the soft evening haze. This was the rhythm of daily life for centuries. And yet, behind this serene, practical innovation lay one of the most quietly astonishing feats of agricultural engineering in the pre-Columbian world. In this final section, we travel deeper into the long-term impact of Chinampas, not only their resilience and role in feeding a vast urban population, but also the quiet persistence of the system through conquest, colonization, and modern times. The Chinampa was not just a method of farming. It was a structure that echoed a worldview, order, duality, and the sacred nature of nourishment, feeding a city of islands at the height of the Aztec Empire. Tenochtitlan housed perhaps 200,000 people, comparable to any European capital of its time. And yet, it was an island. Not just metaphorically, but physically. An island rising out of the water, surrounded by canals, causeways, and Chinampas. These floating gardens, though technically anchored to the lakebed, formed a network so dense that from a distance, they seemed to float like lily. They weren't merely patches of food production. They were administrative zones, carefully allocated by priests and scribes who understood which fields belonged to temples, which to warriors, and which to commoners. Each rectangular plot was carefully tracked by size and yield. Harvest quotas were recorded in codices made from bark paper or deerskin. In a society with no wheels, no beasts of burden, and no metal tools, such organization was astonishing. Perhaps more astonishing still was the yield. Chinampas were so fertile that they could be harvested multiple times per year, often 7 or more cycles annually. Corn, beans, chilies, squash, tomatoes, amaranth, and even flowers like marigolds and dahlias sprang from the damp soil. This allowed the city to thrive without needing massive land conquests purely for food. It was a form of agricultural self-sufficiency rarely seen in ancient megacities, and while European farms required rest years for soil recovery, the Aztecs' rotating layers of silt and compost kept Chinampas eternally productive. This wasn't just technology. It was devotion to a sacred landscape. The world turned upside down then. In 1519, Spanish ships appeared on the Gulf Coast, their white sails billowing like bones in the wind. Within 2 years, Tenochtitlan would fall. The great temples would be burned or dismantled, the aqueducts smashed, the causeways clogged with rubble and disease, and yet strangely the Chinampas endured. Perhaps it was because they were not made of stone or gold. Perhaps the conquistadors saw them as mere gardens. Perhaps they simply didn't understand them. Or perhaps the Spanish quickly realized their usefulness. Indeed, after the conquest, Chinampas continued to feed the new city that rose from Tenochtitlan's ashes, Mexico City. The Spanish repurposed them, leasing them to local growers and Franciscan monasteries. Indigenous farmers, many of whom had lost their lands or rights, became tenant laborers on the very Chinampas their ancestors had built. Records from the 16th and 17th centuries show that Chinampa produce continued to be sold in the markets of Mexico City, but with a different currency, a different tongue, and a different god presiding over the transaction. Still, the canals flowed. The mud layers grew. The farmers returned each dawn with their reed baskets and wooden tools. In this way, Chinampas became ghosts surviving ruins of a vanished empire. Disguised as ordinary farmland, quiet science in the mud, centuries passed. Empires rose and fell, and the Chinampas remained. By the 19th century, European botanists and geographers traveling through Mexico began to write curiously about these floating gardens. They described with fascination how layers of aquatic plants, sediment, and manure created soil of remarkable fertility. Some compared the Chinampas to hydroponics, others to wetlands management systems. Yet few grasped that they were, in essence, observing a pre-modern form of sustainable permaculture. Chinampas were a form of ecological engineering long before such a phrase existed. The canals between them acted as irrigation reservoirs, fish farms, and nutrient conduits. The planting cycles followed lunar calendars and climate rhythms. Ducks, frogs, and aquatic insects all became part of the controlled ecology. Even their rectangular shaped, typically 2.5 to 3 meters wide, and up to 30 meters long, was not arbitrary. This size allowed for easy weeding, even watering, and perfect canal navigation by canoe. These were not the chaotic vegetable patches of peasants. They were laboratories of careful observation. The farmers who worked them may not have used words like carbon sequestration or water conservation, but they lived it quietly with muddy hands and reed sandals. A shallow breath from extinction in the 20th century as Mexico City expanded. The lake system that had cradled the Chinampas began to vanish. Drained, paved over, or diverted into sewage canals, the water that once fed the Chinampas disappeared by degrees. Urban sprawl crept over farmland. Traffic rumbled where canoes once glided. The Chinampas of Calco were lost beneath concrete. Others became dry lots, useless for crops. Only in pockets like Xochimilco did the old ways linger. Even then, only a few traditional farmers remained, often elderly, often working for little profit, often overshadowed by tourism, and yet, even today, there are still Chinampas. They exist not as museum pieces, but as quiet survivors. In early morning fog, you might still see a lone canoe gliding across the water, carrying crates of herbs and vegetables into the city's markets, and sometimes, younger generations return urban. Ecologists, indigenous activists, permaculture students seeking to revive what their ancestors once knew. They come with clipboards and smartphones, yes, but also with hands willing to touch the earth. Some farmers, like the Jimenez family in San Gregorio Acapulco, have kept their chinampas alive for generations. They plant cempasúchil flowers for Dia de los Muertos. They harvest quilites wild, greens for tamales. They still stir the mud. It is not efficient. It is not profitable. It is not convenient. But it is alive mud in memory. So what is the legacy of the Chinampa? Not merely a floating farm. Not just a clever use of mud. But a philosophy of place. A belief that the land and water can work together if we let them. The Chinampa is a story written in reeds and silt, updated by hands rather than pens. It whispers of a time when cities fed themselves with art and ecology, not concrete and combustion. Even now, as modern life thunders forward, you can still, if you listen closely, hear the quiet splash of a pole in the water, the hush of wind over willows, and the soft crunch of footsteps on damp earth. And perhaps you wonder, if the Aztecs could feed a city with mud, reeds, and dreams, what exactly have we forgotten? Thank you for spending your time with us tonight, drifting through the quiet corners of history. If this story helped you relax, rest, or simply wander a little through the past, we'd be so grateful if you'd take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the Quiet Boring Sleep channel. There are many more forgotten stories waiting to be told, and your support helps us keep them alive softly, slowly, and one sleepy tale at a time. Until next time, sleep well, good night, and take care.